Welcome to episode 3. Tonight we're talking heat treating and finish grinding, and we're gonna get started now. Alright, so we went ahead and got everything profiled. We got our handle pins drilled in place, and we got our bevels ground. It is time for heat treatment of this bad boy. You could heat treat 1095 a lot of different ways. We're gonna use a canola oil to quench this knife in. What we're gonna do to make that oil a little more adequate for quenching 1095 is we're gonna raise the temperature on the canola oil to about 125, 130 degrees before we use it. And that's gonna make it a little thinner viscosity, and it will be better for heat treating this 1095 steel. Now on the heat treating process, for a new knife maker, let's make this super easy. All you're gonna need is a torch or a forge. I'm gonna use my forge, but you could very easily heat this with a torch in the exact same fashion. And then you're gonna heat it till it's non-magnetic. So all you need is a magnet and a torch. And you're gonna slowly heat the edge with your torch until when you hold it to the magnet, it doesn't stick anymore. And that's gonna tell you that the metal is moved into solution and it's ready to be quenched. So I run my knife in the forge at a low heat until the entire blade goes non-magnetic, and I heat it just slightly longer, and then I go in for a quench in a preheated quenchant oil. Tonight we're gonna use canola oil heated up to about 125 to 130 degrees. And we're gonna quench this knife. I'm gonna go ahead and stamp my maker's mark in it before heat treatment. When the metal is in this annealed soft state, I could take my stamp and just boom, got a maker's mark. I like to use a stamp rather than electro etch, but that's kind of up to each different maker. But now would be the time to put your stamp in it if you want to stamp it. I used to stamp these while they were hot. But the problem I found with that is you stamp this while it's hot. If you lay it flat and you stamp it right there, it kind of bends the blade both directions, and then it started to introduce warps into my blades from that hot stamping. So I stopped doing that. Now I cold stamp the metal and then I heat treat it, and it works great every time. So I'm gonna take you over. I'm gonna go ahead and show you how I stamp it. I am gonna use my forge to heat treat this, but basically that's a torch that's inside of a housing. So it's the exact same thing. I just don't have a torch, so I'm not gonna go buy a torch just to show you how to heat treat with the torch. You guys can figure that out. Just fire up your torch, and what I would do is you're gonna need a good hot glove, but you could even put this in a vise while you're heating it, and you're gonna heat the edge until it's non-magnetic. You just keep testing it with the magnet, and once that magnet doesn't stick anymore, make sure you've got a good even heat all the way from here to here where the magnet doesn't stick, and then immediately go to your quench oil. You have to go immediately. I think the book says that you have less than 1.5 seconds to go from heat to quench to get the full edge hardness out of 1095. So that is super quick. And then when you put the knife in your quenchant oil, it's very important to agitate your knife very quickly, because what happens is a vapor jacket can form on this metal where it's not allowing the oil direct contact to the surface area, and it's not gonna quench the steel as fast as it should. So yes, we're gonna preheat the oil. That helps. That's thinning the viscosity of the oil so the oil can reach the surface faster. I know it seems completely counterintuitive to heat the oil to make this cool faster, but that is true. So we're going to heat the oil to thin the viscosity of the oil. That will help the oil reach the surface area of the steel faster. And then when we go to quench it, we're going to agitate the knife, not sideways because that could introduce warps. We're going to agitate it really fast up and down to try to release the vapor barrier that's forming on the metal from the heat. So we're just going to really quickly agitate it in the oil. After that, we're going to take a file and we're going to make sure that we can skate a file. That means that the teeth of the file do not grab the metal. If this skates a file, then that means that we got it hard enough to make a knife out of. The files are going to be harder than most knives already. So if this skates a file, then this is going to be very hard, and then it'll be ready for us to put into the oven for a temper cycle. So let's go ahead and get started. we're gonna put it right there. So I'm gonna turn this sideways so I can see it, because this is very important. You definitely don't want to get this part wrong. Get that right where you want it. I use a nice heavy hammer so I can get a good smack on it. Make sure that I'm square. That's where I'm gonna want it. Boom. It's there. Yeah. So I'm gonna use my forge just because this is what I got. Use what you have. This is what I use to heat treat my quenching tank with. All right, so here's the knife. We just got it heat treated. We got it tempered in the oven at 425 for 2 hours. That's pretty good for 1095. Now what we're gonna wanna do is take it into the finishing processes. When I profile this to clean up this outside edge and I slide it across my work surface, sometimes it introduces scratches on the flats. So I definitely don't want to sand the flats first and then profile it because I'll add new scratches. So what I like to do is I like to refine my profile and take that out to about 400 grit. Obviously when we put the handles on, we're gonna touch that up again. So 400 grit's fine for the profile. And then I'm gonna go ahead and sand the flats, both sides, and get those dialed in. And then we'll move on to grinding the finish grind on the bevels. When the flats are sanded, then we can go ahead and mark our grind to line here on the top for these bevels, and that'll be real precision. Let's get to it. Just a quick note about this small wheel attachment on my grinder that I use. I use this to get in here and do these areas right here of my knives. You can use a lot of different things to do the same procedure. You can have a spindle sander that has a sanding radius like this that moves up and down. You could take one of those sanding drums and mount it in your drill press, and then you can use this on your drill press table and move your drill press up and down. Or you can put this in a vise and use a Dremel tool in here. There's lots of different ways that you can clean this up. So don't feel like you can't do the same processes that I'm doing because you don't own this equipment. But I do own this equipment, so I feel like I should use it. You never want to stop in any place. Right from the second you touch it, you want to move right through. If you stop or dwell in one place, you're going to cause a divot. That's the worst thing that you can do. All right. That's looking good there. There we go. So what I do to sand my flats is I throw a piece of wood in a vise, like so. A big C-clamp, I lay the blade on there. C-clamp has seen better days apparently. This is my sanding fixture. Can't get any easier than that. I mean, we're talking like you could just rip a 2x4 and use this. What this allows me to do is have a flat surface to sand on where I can sand these flats and not get poked by the tip. So this is my setup for hand sanding. Bucket of water, sanding sled, knife. I've got strips of 220 cut here and anything that's flat. So what I'll do is I'll use this to wrap my sandpaper around and sand these flats. You never want to touch this with sandpaper without it on some sort of backing material so that you don't roll over your edges, because remember, you're trying to keep that edge crispy. You're trying to sand these flats without rolling over the edges, and you also don't want to create any other imperfections by pushing your fingers in with sandpaper. So the worst thing that you could do is to use your thumb on a piece of sandpaper. That's definitely not what we're going for here. I used to use Windex because it doesn't cause your blade to rust, but now I've done this so long, I just use water through the whole process because I'm doing these knives from start to finish pretty rapidly. Now, if I do walk away from a knife at night, all I do is make sure that I dry it off really well and throw some oil on it. Other than that, the water works really, really well because you can throw a lot of water on there, which helps your sandpaper last longer, your wet dry sandpaper. This paper's made to work in a wet condition. So yeah, you can use Windex on it and that works good, but Windex dries out my hands a lot more than just using water. So I definitely like this method of just using water with the sandpaper, and it allows you to get some really nice finishes super quick too. Alright, now when you look at these flats, you look at how far you're going to sand up. Don't worry about sanding scratches down here if you're going to grind all the way to up here. So I'm not worried about any of this. Really, the area I'm looking at to make sure I've got dialed in is right here where I've got my maker's mark and along the top of the spine here. And this is also a good time to know what you're shooting for an end product. If you're going for a high polish, well, you better get it right now. That's all I gotta say about that. I personally don't like shiny knives, so I generally work to a 220 and then I move right to a 500. I get most of the scratches out, and then I go for an acid etch to darken it up because that's what I prefer. Alright, so that's good on that side. Just in case you're not a fan of hand sanding, you could take a magnet, your blade like that. You could come up to a grinder and you can grind these flats also. Just, you have to be really careful on a grinder when you're grinding flats on a magnet like this. If you accidentally push in, since this material is so thin down here at the tip of your bevels, you can stretch this out and then it makes it a lot harder to get your bevel straight. It's really easy to weight this wrong on a flat. So if you decide that you want to go to the grinder and grind flats, you have to be really careful. What I like to do is put the magnet up high on the handle section. That way when you come to the grinder and you press, you're actually putting all the force on the flat of the handle and you're less likely to pivot down on this thinner section here. And this will just clean itself up. It's really important after heat treat not to overheat your blade. So you'll notice when I'm grinding, I'll hit this, go right to my bucket. Go right to my bucket. And I never wear gloves to grind after heat treatment because my hands need to feel how hot this is getting. You can overheat this tip in a second I mean, in just a second and you've ruined it, especially when you're grinding in your bevels. Now, when you're talking abrasives, the higher you go in grit, the more heat that's going to be generated because there's more surface area contact. So if you got a 36 grit belt on here, yeah, it's throwing huge sparks, but your metal's running cooler than if you've got a 220 grit belt on here with almost no sparks, and this thing is just burning up almost immediately. So you really have to feel the metal and make sure that you're not overheating it. It's really important. Okay, so let's go in here and hit this. Alright, we got the flats cleaned up. Now it's time to go back to the trusty layout fluid. Put a little bit on both sides. We're going to lay this out so we can mark out how high we want our bevels. And then we'll put our bevel jig back on and finish grind this bad boy. Now, keep in mind, this is a very simplistic design. I'm going to do a whole bunch of more tutorials and show you the progression in knife making all the way up to some of your hardest designs. I figured I'd start with an easy one and move up from there. Let's go. I don't want to go too much higher than we've already got there. Let's go right about there. Okay, so when you go to put your jig back on, you want to put your jig back on slightly behind where it was before so that you can grind a new shoulder in that's more precision. Slightly behind where it was before. Just slightly. Okay, so I've just put a fresh 80 grit belt on here. That's one pass. It went from nasty heat treated scale, one pass, cleaned up bevels. Okay, so right there, you can see I've got a little bit more blue here, less there, and more here. So I need to grind more here and grind more here until that blue catches up with where I'm at here. When this catches up to that, then I can start taking even swipes. perfect grind. All right, now I'm going to take you to the other side and get a close-up so you can see it from start to finish close. That's what we're starting with. I want to make sure that this is in focus. All right, see how I've got a lot of blue up here? And I've got a lot of material right here that's not getting ground off yet. So I need to work on this area before I come back to this area here. I'll show you. That helps. Okay. So now it's even from here all the way up. So I'll go back to taking full swipes at it. So now I've got it even here, but I've still got a little more up there to go. Be really careful not to overheat that tip. There we go. All right. There it is. So tonight we cleaned up the profile first, then we sanded the flats, and then we finished ground the bevels. Next we'll move on to hand sanding. Hand sanding is an extremely integral part of knife making, so I'm going to dedicate an entire video to how to hand sand properly. That'll be part 4. I'll see you guys there.